The radio crackled with static as Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez adjusted his headset, watching the dusty road stretch endlessly toward the horizon. In 30 seconds, his ordinary Tuesday morning would become a fight for survival that would test every skill the Navy SEALs had drilled into him. 5 armed insurgents were already moving into position, their weapons trained on the checkpoint where Rodriguez and his team conducted routine vehicle inspections. But these attackers had made one critical mistake. They didn't know that the quiet combat controller coordinating air traffic had spent 2 years in the most elite special operations unit in the world. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person in any situation is the one you least expect. This is the true story of how training, instinct, and split-second decisions turned a potential massacre into a masterclass in tactical response. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating base Chapman, casting long shadows across the checkpoint that separated the relative safety of the American compound from the unpredictable Afghan countryside. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez wiped sweat from his forehead as he monitored the radio frequencies, his weathered hands moving across the communication equipment with practiced ease. At 32, Rodriguez had seen more combat zones than most soldiers twice his age, but today felt different somehow. Rodriguez had been assigned to the base as a combat controller just 3 months earlier, tasked with coordinating air traffic and providing communication support for the various units operating in the region. To his fellow soldiers, he was simply another specialist doing his job. What they didn't know was that Rodriguez carried with him 2 years of intensive training from the Navy SEALs, an experience that had shaped not just his tactical skills, but his entire approach to survival. The checkpoint itself was a standard military setup: concrete barriers, sandbags, and a small building that served as both shelter and observation post. 2 Army MPs, Corporal James Patterson and Private First Class Sarah Chen, handled the vehicle inspections while Rodriguez maintained communications from his position inside the building. It was routine work, the kind that could lull even experienced soldiers into a false sense of security. Patterson, a 24-year-old from Ohio, had been working checkpoints for 8 months. He'd developed an easy rapport with the local civilians who passed through daily, often sharing jokes despite the language barrier. Chen, barely 21 and fresh from military police training, brought an attention to detail that complemented Patterson's experience with people. Together, they made an effective team, thorough but not unnecessarily aggressive. Rodriguez watched them work through the reinforced window of the communication post. His SEAL training had taught him to constantly assess his environment, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might signal danger. This morning, something was off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The traffic flow seemed normal at first glance. Local vendors heading to market with their small trucks loaded with produce, a few civilian cars carrying families, the usual mix of pedestrians. But Rodriguez's trained eye caught subtle differences. The timing was slightly off. Normally, the morning rush began around 7:30 and peaked by 8:15. Today, the flow had started earlier and seemed more controlled, more purposeful. Rodriguez keyed his radio and contacted the base's intelligence unit. Control, this is Rodriguez at Checkpoint Alpha. Are we expecting any unusual activity today? Traffic patterns seemed different. The response crackled back through his headset. Negative, Rodriguez. No specific threats reported. Maintain normal operations but stay alert. Rodriguez acknowledged the transmission but continued watching. His SEAL instructors had drilled into him the importance of trusting his instincts, of recognizing when something didn't feel right even when he couldn't articulate why. The feeling was growing stronger by the minute. At 8:47, a white pickup truck approached the checkpoint. Rodriguez noticed it immediately because the driver was taking an unusual route, coming from a side road that was rarely used. The truck moved slowly, deliberately, and Rodriguez could see at least 3 occupants in the cab. Patterson stepped out to meet the vehicle, following standard procedure. He signaled for the driver to stop and approached with his weapon at the ready but not raised, maintaining the balance between caution and respect that was essential for checkpoint operations. Rodriguez shifted his position to get a better view, his hand unconsciously moving toward his sidearm. Something about the truck's occupants bothered him. Their posture was too rigid, too alert. They weren't exhibiting the relaxed behavior of civilians going about their daily business. Through his binoculars, Rodriguez could see the driver's face clearly. The man was sweating despite the early morning temperature, his eyes darting constantly between Patterson and the surrounding area. In the passenger seat, another man sat unnaturally straight, his hands positioned in a way that suggested he was concealing something. Patterson began his standard inspection routine, asking for identification and inquiring about the truck's destination. The driver responded in broken English, claiming to be transporting supplies to a village 10 kilometers away. But Rodriguez noticed inconsistencies in the story and the driver's behavior that suggested deception. Rodriguez activated his radio again. "Patterson, advise caution on the white pickup. Something doesn't feel right about these guys." Patterson's voice came back steady and professional. "Copy that." Proceeding with extended inspection. As Patterson asked the occupants to exit the vehicle, Rodriguez spotted movement in his peripheral vision. Two men had emerged from a building roughly 50 meters to the east of the checkpoint. They were trying to appear casual, but Rodriguez's trained eye caught the telltale signs of people with hostile intent. Their movements were too coordinated, too purposeful. Rodriguez immediately began scanning the surrounding area more systematically. His SEAL training had taught him that attacks rarely came from just one direction, and if he was seeing two potential threats, there were likely more he hadn't spotted yet. His systematic scan paid off. Behind a small wall to the west, he caught a glimpse of metal that didn't belong, the barrel of a rifle being positioned. To the north, a figure was moving between buildings in a pattern that suggested flanking movement. Rodriguez's pulse quickened as the tactical situation became clear. The checkpoint was being surrounded by at least 5 armed individuals, and the white pickup truck was likely the signal or distraction for a coordinated attack. Patterson and Chen were exposed and outnumbered, unaware of the full scope of the threat developing around them. Rodriguez made a split-second decision that would define the next several minutes of all their lives. Rather than simply calling for backup and hoping it would arrive in time, he chose to act immediately. His SEAL training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, outnumbered, with limited resources responsible for protecting others. He activated his emergency radio channel, broadcasting to the entire base. "Base control, checkpoint Alpha, under imminent attack. Multiple hostiles surrounding position. Immediate assistance required." Without waiting for a response, Rodriguez grabbed his rifle and moved to the door of the communication post. His mind was already shifting into the tactical mode that had kept him alive through countless SEAL operations. He began mentally cataloging the positions of the threats, calculating angles of fire, planning movement routes. The attack began exactly as Rodriguez had anticipated. The first shots came from the east, where the two men he'd spotted earlier opened fire on Patterson's position. The sound of automatic weapons fire shattered the morning calm, sending civilians scrambling for cover and announcing the beginning of a firefight that would test every aspect of Rodriguez's training and experience. Patterson dove behind the concrete barrier as bullets sparked off the pavement around him. Chen, who had been checking the truck's cargo area, found herself pinned down on the opposite side of the vehicle. The truck's occupants had produced weapons from concealment and were adding their fire to the assault. Rodriguez assessed the situation in the space of a heartbeat. His teammates were separated, under fire from multiple directions, and facing at least 5 armed attackers. A normal response would be to take cover, call for help, and wait for reinforcements. But Rodriguez knew that in this situation, waiting meant watching his fellow soldiers die. Instead, he did something that would later be analyzed in military academies as a textbook example of aggressive defensive tactics. Rather than staying in the relative safety of the communication post, Rodriguez burst through the door and immediately engaged the nearest threat, using his superior training and tactical knowledge to turn what should have been a massacre into something very different. The battle for Checkpoint Alpha had begun, and Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was about to demonstrate why SEAL training produces some of the most effective soldiers in the world. Rodriguez exploded from the communication post with lethal precision, his rifle already raised and ready. The first target was clear: the gunman behind the eastern wall who had initiated the attack on Patterson. Rodriguez's SEAL training kicked in automatically, muscle memory taking over as he acquired his target through his weapon's optics. The shot was clean and decisive. The eastern gunman dropped immediately, his weapon clattering against the concrete wall. But Rodriguez was already moving, never staying stationary for more than a few seconds. His instructors had hammered this principle into him: a stationary target is a dead target. Patterson, still pinned behind a concrete barrier, heard the distinctive crack of Rodriguez's rifle and immediately understood that help had arrived. Through the chaos of gunfire, he shouted, "Rodriguez!" 3 more positions: west wall, north building, and the truck. Rodriguez acknowledged with a sharp nod, even though Patterson couldn't see him from his current position. The combat controller was already calculating his next moves, drawing on tactical lessons learned in far more dangerous situations than this one. The key was to maintain the initiative, to keep the attackers reacting to his actions rather than allowing them to execute their planned assault. The truck presented the most immediate danger to Chen, who was still trapped near the vehicle with at least 2 armed occupants firing from inside the cab. Rodriguez knew he had to neutralize that threat quickly or risk losing one of his teammates. Instead of approaching the truck directly, which would expose him to fire from the other positions, Rodriguez used a technique called indirect approach that he'd mastered during SEAL training. He moved laterally, using the checkpoint's concrete barriers as cover while positioning himself for a flanking shot on the truck. The attackers in the vehicle were focused on Chen's position, trying to finish her quickly before dealing with other threats. This tunnel vision, common among untrained fighters, gave Rodriguez the opening he needed. He moved to a position where he could see into the truck's cab from the side, raised his weapon, and fired 2 quick shots. The driver slumped forward over the steering wheel, and the passenger, wounded but still dangerous, tried to turn his weapon toward Rodriguez's position. But the combat controller was already moving again, and the wounded attacker's shots went wide, striking empty concrete and dirt. Chen, recognizing her opportunity, rolled out from behind the truck and sprinted toward better cover. As she moved, Rodriguez provided covering fire, keeping the wounded attacker suppressed while his teammate repositioned herself safely behind the main checkpoint building. 2 down, 3 to go, Rodriguez muttered to himself, already scanning for the next threat. His training had taught him to maintain a running count of enemies, always knowing how many hostiles remained and where they were likely positioned. The gunman behind the western wall had been waiting for Rodriguez to expose himself, and now he opened fire with a burst of automatic rifle fire. Bullets whined past Rodriguez's head, some close enough that he could feel the air displacement. But instead of diving for cover like most soldiers would, Rodriguez did something counterintuitive. He moved toward the threat. This aggressive movement, known as violence of action in special operations terminology, was designed to overwhelm and confuse the enemy. Most attackers expect their targets to seek cover when fired upon, not charge directly at them. Rodriguez's unexpected response bought him precious seconds as the Western gunman hesitated, trying to understand why his target was advancing instead of retreating. Those seconds were all Rodriguez needed. He reached a position where he could see over the western wall and immediately engaged the surprised attacker. The gunman, caught off guard by Rodriguez's aggressive tactics, was unable to adjust his position quickly enough to counter the threat bearing down on him. The third attacker fell, and Rodriguez immediately transitioned to locating the remaining 2 threats. His systematic approach to the battle was methodical but lightning fast, each decision flowing naturally from his training and experience. Patterson, who had been watching Rodriguez's tactical display with amazement, finally found an opportunity to contribute to the fight. The northern attacker, who had been moving between buildings trying to find a good firing position, exposed himself briefly as he attempted to get an angle on Rodriguez. Patterson's shot was good, catching the 4th attacker center mass and dropping him immediately. The Army NP might not have had Rodriguez's advanced training, but he was a competent soldier who could take advantage of opportunities when they presented themselves. "Nice shot, Patterson," Rodriguez called out, genuinely impressed with his teammates' marksmanship under pressure. But there was no time for extended congratulations. 1 attacker remained, and Rodriguez knew from experience that the last enemy in a firefight was often the most dangerous. The 5th attacker had positioned himself in a building to the northeast, probably intended to serve as an overwatch position for the assault. From there, he had a good view of the entire checkpoint area and multiple escape routes if the attack went badly. He was also the most disciplined of the group, having held his fire while his companions revealed their positions and engaged prematurely. Rodriguez knew this final opponent would be different from the others. The man had demonstrated patience and tactical thinking, which made him significantly more dangerous than the relatively undisciplined fighters they'd already eliminated. The overwatch position presented Rodriguez with a tactical puzzle. The building provided excellent cover for the defender but limited his mobility. However, approaching the building would require crossing open ground where Rodriguez would be exposed to fire from the elevated position. Rodriguez decided to use one of the most advanced techniques from his SEAL training: deception and misdirection combined with precise timing. He began moving in a pattern designed to make the Overwatch sniper believe he was attempting to flank the building from the south. He exposed himself briefly, drew fire, then disappeared behind cover, always moving in a way that suggested his intended approach route. Meanwhile, he was actually preparing for an approach from the completely opposite direction. Rodriguez had spotted a drainage ditch that ran along the north side of the checkpoint area. It wasn't visible from the Overwatch position, and it would allow him to get much closer to the building without being detected. The deception worked perfectly. The sniper shifted his position to cover the southern approach, exactly as Rodriguez had hoped. While the enemy was focused on the wrong area, Rodriguez slipped into the drainage ditch and began his actual approach. The ditch was uncomfortable and filled with muddy water, but it provided complete concealment from the sniper's position. Rodriguez low-crawled through the muddy channel, moving slowly to avoid creating any sound or movement that might alert his target. When he reached a position directly below the building where the sniper was positioned, Rodriguez faced his final challenge. He needed to get from the concealed ditch into the building and eliminate the threat before the sniper realized what was happening. Rodriguez had one advantage. He knew exactly where his opponent was positioned based on the muzzle flashes he'd observed during the firefight. The sniper was on the second floor, in a room facing south toward the checkpoint. If Rodriguez could get into the building and up the stairs quietly, he could approach from behind. The ground floor of the building was empty, probably abandoned when the fighting started. Rodriguez moved through it like a ghost, every step calculated to minimize noise. His SEAL training had included extensive work on silent movement, and those skills served him perfectly now. At the base of the stairs leading to the second floor, Rodriguez paused to listen. He could hear the sniper moving around in the room above, probably repositioning himself to maintain visual contact with the checkpoint area where he expected Rodriguez to eventually appear. Rodriguez began climbing the stairs, testing each step carefully before putting his full weight on it. Old buildings like this, one often had creaky stairs that could give away an approaching threat. He moved slowly, patiently, knowing that rushing now could undo all the tactical advantages he'd gained. When he reached the top of the stairs, Rodriguez could see light coming from under the door of the room where the sniper was positioned. He approached the door carefully, listening for any indication of the enemy's exact position within the room. The sound of a rifle bolt being cycled told Rodriguez exactly what he needed to know. The sniper was positioned near the window, probably preparing for another shot at what he assumed would be Rodriguez's eventual approach from the south. Rodriguez took a deep breath, visualized his entry and engagement sequence, and prepared to finish the fight that had started with 5 attackers trying to overwhelm a routine checkpoint. In the next few seconds, his SEAL training would be put to its ultimate test. Rodriguez positioned himself outside the door, weapon ready, and made his final preparations for room entry. This was one of the most dangerous moments in any tactical situation, the seconds when a soldier transitions from concealment to direct confrontation. His SEAL training had covered room clearing extensively, but every situation was unique, and this one carried the additional pressure of knowing that Patterson and Chen were counting on him to eliminate the final threat. The door was partially open, which gave Rodriguez both an advantage and a disadvantage. He could see into the room without having to manipulate the door, but the same opening that allowed him to observe also provided a potential line of sight for the enemy if the sniper turned around at the wrong moment. Through the gap, Rodriguez could see the sniper positioned exactly where he'd estimated, near the window, rifle trained on the checkpoint area below. The man was completely focused on his Overwatch mission, scanning for targets while remaining unaware that death was standing just feet behind him. Rodriguez knew he had one chance to end this cleanly. If he missed or only wounded the sniper, the man could turn the room into a close-quarters battle that would be extremely dangerous for both of them. The key was speed, precision, and absolute commitment to the shot. He pushed the door open smoothly and stepped into the room with his rifle already raised and aimed. The sniper, alerted by the sound of the door, began to turn around, but Rodriguez was already in the process of firing. The shot was perfect, clean and immediate. The 5th and final attacker dropped without getting off another round. Rodriguez immediately moved to the window to assess the situation below. Patterson was emerging from behind his cover, rifle ready, scanning for additional threats. Chen was doing the same from her position near the checkpoint building. The white pickup truck sat silent, its occupants eliminated, and the morning air was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the ringing silence that follows intense combat. "Clear," Rodriguez shouted down to his teammates. "All threats neutralized. Area secure." The relief in Patterson's voice was evident as he responded. "Copy that." "Outstanding work, Rodriguez. Outstanding." Rodriguez made his way back down the stairs and out of the building, maintaining tactical awareness even though the immediate threat had been eliminated. His SEAL training had taught him that the moments immediately following combat could be just as dangerous as the fight itself, with adrenaline potentially causing lapses in judgment or the possibility of additional threats that hadn't yet revealed themselves. As he rejoined his teammates at the checkpoint, Rodriguez could see both admiration and curiosity in their eyes. Patterson and Chen had known Rodriguez as a competent combat controller, but they just witnessed a tactical performance that went far beyond the skills of a typical communications specialist. Rodriguez, Patterson said. "I've got to ask, where did you learn to fight like that? That wasn't standard army tactics." Rodriguez checked his weapon and began scanning the area for any signs of additional threats before answering. "Navy SEALs, 2 years before I transferred to this job. Most people don't know about that part of my background." Chen shook her head in amazement. 5 attackers coordinated assault and you took them down like it was a training exercise. Why didn't you tell us you were former special forces? "Because it wasn't relevant to my current job," Rodriguez replied simply. "I'm here to handle communications and air support coordination. The fact that I used to do other things doesn't matter for day-to-day operations." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. The backup that Rodriguez had called for was finally arriving, along with the base's quick reaction force and medical personnel. Within minutes, the checkpoint area was swarming with soldiers, medics, and investigators. Major Sarah Williams, the base operations officer, was among the first to arrive. She immediately began assessing the situation, taking reports from the 3 checkpoint personnel and examining the positions where the attackers had been eliminated. "Walk me through this," Major Williams said to Rodriguez. 5 attackers, coordinated assault, and you neutralized all of them with no friendly casualties. I need to understand exactly how this went down." Rodriguez provided a detailed tactical briefing, explaining how he'd identified the threat, his decision-making process, and the specific techniques he'd used to eliminate each attacker. Major Williams listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification on technical points or tactical decisions. "Your background wasn't in your personnel file," she noted. "SEAL training is something we should have known about. It was classified for operational security reasons during my transfer. My previous unit handled some sensitive missions, and they preferred to keep personnel records minimal for anyone rotating to new assignments." Major Williams made notes on her tablet. "Well, it's going in your file now. This kind of tactical skill set is something we need to know about, especially given our current operational environment." As the investigation continued, Rodriguez found himself thinking about the broader implications of what had just happened. The attack had been well planned and coordinated, suggesting a level of intelligence and preparation that was concerning. 5 attackers with good weapons and tactical positions didn't just appear randomly at a checkpoint. The intelligence officer who arrived with the investigation team, Captain Lisa Chen, no relation to the MP, began interrogating Rodriguez about anything he might have noticed in the days leading up to the attack. "Any changes in local traffic patterns? New faces? Vehicles that seemed out of place?" she asked. "Do you ask some anybody?" Rodriguez thought carefully before answering. "This morning felt different from the beginning. Traffic was earlier than usual, more controlled. I noticed it but couldn't put my finger on exactly what was wrong until the white truck arrived." Captain Chen made notes. "The white truck was probably reconnaissance, checking your procedures and timing. They would have been observing the checkpoint for days, maybe weeks, before attempting this assault." This revelation made Rodriguez realize that his instincts had been picking up on surveillance activities that his conscious mind hadn't fully processed. The subtle wrongness he'd felt that morning had been his subconscious recognizing patterns that indicated hostile observation. "The good news," Captain Chen continued, "is that they clearly underestimated your capabilities. They planned for a soft target, a routine checkpoint with standard security procedures. They had no way of knowing they were attacking a position defended by someone with your level of training and experience." Over the next several hours, Rodriguez participated in detailed debriefings with various military officials. His actions were being analyzed, not just as a successful defensive engagement, but as a case study in how advanced training could alter the outcome of seemingly hopeless tactical situations. The base commander, Colonel Robert Hayes, personally thanked Rodriguez for his actions. "You saved the lives of your teammates and probably prevented a much larger attack on the base itself," he said. "This kind of assault was likely intended to draw out our quick reaction force, creating opportunities for secondary attacks." Rodriguez accepted the praise but remained focused on the lessons learned from the engagement. His SEAL training had taught him to always analyze combat situations for ways to improve future performance, even when the outcome had been successful. The key was recognizing the threat early, he explained to the assembled officers during his final debrief. "If I hadn't trusted my instincts about the traffic patterns in the white truck, we would have been caught completely off guard. Training is important, but situational awareness is what kept us alive." 3 days later, Rodriguez was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor for his actions during the checkpoint assault. The citation specifically noted his exceptional tactical skill, decisive leadership under fire, and selfless dedication to protecting his fellow soldiers. But for Rodriguez, the real satisfaction came from knowing that Patterson and Chen had gone home safely to their families. That was the true measure of success in any military operation, bringing everyone home alive. The checkpoint incident became legendary among the soldiers at Forward Operating Base Chapman. But Rodriguez returned to his normal duties as a combat controller the next day. To him, the firefight had been an unusual application of his skills, not a defining moment of his military career. However, his secret was now out. Word spread quickly through the base that the quiet communications specialist was actually a former Navy SEAL, and Rodriguez found himself fielding requests for tactical advice and training from other units. Rodriguez agreed to conduct some informal training sessions for base personnel, sharing techniques for situational awareness, tactical decision-making, and combat stress management. He never talked about the specific missions he'd conducted with the SEALs, but he was willing to pass on skills that could help other soldiers survive dangerous situations. The checkpoint incident ultimately led to changes in security procedures throughout the region, with increased emphasis on recognizing pre-attack surveillance and improving coordination between different types of military personnel stationed at forward positions. For Rodriguez, it served as a reminder that military skills are never really obsolete, they simply wait for the moment when they're needed most. His 2 years with the Navy SEALs had ended, but the training and mindset they'd given him remained an integral part of who he was as a soldier. 6 months later, Rodriguez completed his deployment and returned to the United States, where he continued his career as a combat controller. He never sought publicity for the checkpoint incident, but the story followed him throughout his military career, serving as an example of how proper training, quick thinking, and decisive action could turn disaster into victory. The 5 attackers who had thought they were targeting a routine military checkpoint had instead encountered one of the most highly trained soldiers in the American military. Their mistake had cost them their lives and potentially saved many others. For Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, it was simply another day of doing his job, protecting his fellow soldiers and serving his country.